In 1998, a 12-year-old girl vanished without a trace on Halloween night. But 18 years later, when a family was cleaning out their deceased grandfather's attic, they found something that would shatter everything the police thought they knew about what happened to her. Inside a dusty cardboard box tucked behind Christmas decorations that hadn't been touched in decades was a small orange Halloween bag still filled with candy from that terrible night. The discovery would lead one grieving mother down a path she never expected, forcing her to confront not just the truth about her daughter's disappearance, but the devastating reality of who had been living right under their noses all along. Margaret Chen had spent 18 years trapped in the suspended animation of unresolved grief. Every Halloween brought the same ritual of hope and despair, the same phone calls to Detective Rodriguez, who had long since retired from the case, but still answered her calls with patient kindness. Every October 31st, she would sit by the window of their modest suburban home, watching trick-or-treaters skip down the sidewalk in their costumes, each small figure a painful reminder of the daughter who never came home. The routine had become as predictable as it was heartbreaking. Margaret would wake on Halloween morning with a familiar knot in her stomach, spend the day moving through the motions of normal life while battling waves of memory and regret, then position herself at the living room window as darkness fell. She would watch the parade of children in their elaborate costumes, searching each small face for features that might belong to Sarah, now grown into a woman Margaret would never recognize. Sarah Chen had been dressed as a princess that night, complete with a pink tiara that kept sliding down over her dark hair. Margaret could still see her daughter's gap-toothed grin as she adjusted the plastic crown one final time before heading out into the crisp autumn evening. Sarah had been so excited about the neighborhood Halloween party at the community center, chattering endlessly about which houses gave out full-size candy bars and whether her best friend Jessica would remember to save her a seat at the costume contest. The memory played in Margaret's mind with the clarity of a film reel, every detail preserved with painful precision. Sarah had spent weeks planning her costume, insisting on adding her own creative touches to the store-bought princess dress. She had sewn silver sequins around the neckline with Margaret's help, painted her fingernails with sparkly pink polish, and practiced her princess wave in the bathroom mirror until she had perfected what she called her royal greeting. That afternoon, Sarah had been practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. She had laid her costume out on her bed 3 different times, rearranging the accessories and asking Margaret's opinion about whether she should wear her hair up or down with the tiara. They had talked about safety rules, established a curfew of 9 o'clock, and discussed which neighborhoods were approved for trick-or-treating. Sarah had listened attentively to every instruction, nodding seriously when Margaret reminded her to stay with Jessica and call if there were any problems. The last confirmed sighting had been at 7:23 p.m., captured on the security camera outside Morrison's drugstore, 3 blocks from their house. Sarah could be seen skipping along the sidewalk, her Halloween bag swinging from her wrist, completely unaware that she was walking toward a fate that would consume her family's life for nearly 2 decades. The grainy black and white footage had been analyzed frame by frame, enhanced by FBI specialists, and broadcast on news programs so many times that Margaret could recite the exact timestamp from memory. The initial investigation had been thorough, methodical, and ultimately fruitless. Detective Luis Rodriguez had thrown himself into the case with the determination of a man who understood that every hour mattered when a child disappeared. He had coordinated search parties that combed through every wooded area within a 10-mile radius, organized door-to-door canvassing that covered hundreds of homes, and followed up on tips that ranged from credible leads to desperate fantasies from well-meaning strangers. Police had interviewed hundreds of neighbors, from elderly Mrs. Patterson, who had been handing out homemade cookies for 40 years, to the teenage Morrison boys, who had been setting off firecrackers behind the elementary school. They had searched every basement and attic within a 5-mile radius, dragged the nearby pond twice with sonar equipment, and followed leads that stretched across state lines. When possible, sightings were reported from as far away as Nevada and Florida. Sarah's face had been plastered on milk cartons and missing person websites before such resources were common. Her story featured on America's Most Wanted when John Walsh personally took interest in the case. Local news broadcasts had covered every development in the investigation, from the initial search efforts to the heartbreaking press conferences where Margaret pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The media attention had been both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it kept Sarah's disappearance in the public consciousness, generating tips and keeping pressure on law enforcement to continue pursuing leads. On the other hand, it turned Margaret's private grief into a public spectacle, forcing her to relive her worst moments in front of television cameras while fighting to maintain hope for her daughter's safe return. Margaret's marriage to Sarah's father hadn't survived the strain. David had needed to believe their daughter was still alive somewhere, still growing up, still celebrating birthdays in some distant place where she might one day find her way home. He had converted Sarah's bedroom into a shrine, leaving everything exactly as it had been on October 31st, 1998, convinced that she would return to find her stuffed animals and homework assignments waiting for her. Margaret had needed to prepare for the worst, to accept that her baby might never walk through their front door again. She had wanted to donate Sarah's outgrown clothes to charity, to transform the bedroom into a memorial space rather than a frozen moment in time. The fundamental difference in how they processed their grief had created an unbridgeable chasm that eventually led to divorce papers signed through tears and custody arrangements that no longer mattered. David had remarried within 3 years, moved to Arizona with his new wife, and gradually stopped calling on Sarah's birthday and the anniversary of her disappearance. Margaret understood his need to build a new life, to escape the geographic reminders of their loss, but his absence had added another layer of isolation to her already overwhelming grief. She found herself not only mourning her daughter, but mourning the family unit that had been destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. The years had blurred together in a haze of false hope and crushing disappointment. There had been the call about a girl found in Oregon who had the same dark hair and brown eyes, the tip about a teenager spotted at a bus station in Michigan, the witness who swore she had seen Sarah at a shopping mall in Texas. Each lead had sent Margaret's heart racing with possibility, only to crash back to earth when DNA tests or careful investigation revealed that the girl in question was someone else's missing daughter, or a runaway who bore only a superficial resemblance to Sarah. Margaret had joined support groups for families of missing children, attended conferences about abduction prevention, and volunteered with organizations that helped other parents navigate the impossible landscape of unresolved loss. The work had provided some sense of purpose, but it couldn't fill the Sarah-shaped hole in her life or answer the questions that kept her awake at night. Where was her daughter? What had happened in those final moments? Had Sarah been frightened? Had she called for her mother? Now, on this gray November morning in 2016, Margaret sat across from Detective Amy Sullivan, Rodriguez's replacement, staring at a photograph that made her hands shake uncontrollably. The orange Halloween bag in the picture was unmistakably Sarah's, decorated with the same hand-drawn spider web that her daughter had carefully added with black marker the night before trick-or-treating. Margaret remembered watching Sarah work. On that decoration, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she tried to make the web lines perfectly symmetrical. "The DNA on the bag handle matches your daughter's profile," Detective Sullivan said gently, her voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who had delivered too many devastating updates to families frozen in time. But Mrs. Chen, there's something else. We found other items in that attic, items that suggest Sarah wasn't the only child who disappeared from Halloween celebrations over the years. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each revelation adding weight to the terrible knowledge that her daughter's disappearance had been part of something much larger and more horrifying than she had ever imagined. For 18 years, she had held on to the possibility that Sarah's case was a random tragedy, a single moment of bad luck that had destroyed their family's happiness. The idea that it had been part of a calculated pattern, that other families had suffered the same loss, made her grief feel simultaneously less unique and more overwhelming. Detective Sullivan explained that the attic had belonged to Harold Brennan, a 78-year-old man who had lived alone in the same house for 43 years. His family had known him as a quiet, somewhat eccentric grandfather who collected vintage toys and spent his retirement years volunteering at the local children's hospital. He had died peacefully in his sleep the previous month, and his granddaughter Emma had been tasked with cleaning out his possessions before putting the house on the market. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that Harold Brennan had been volunteering at the same hospital where Sarah had been born, where Margaret had spent 3 days in a haze of new mother bliss, marveling at her daughter's tiny fingers and perfect eyelashes. The man who had ultimately stolen Sarah's life had been walking the same halls where she had taken her first breaths, interacting with other children, presenting himself as a caring community member while harboring the darkest of intentions, Emma. Brennan had been expecting to find the usual accumulation of a long life lived in one place: old photographs, outdated electronics, boxes of tax records that probably should have been thrown away years ago. Instead, she had discovered a carefully organized collection that spoke to an obsession far darker than anyone in her family could have imagined. The phone call she had made to police had been shaking and confused, barely coherent, as she tried to describe what she had found in her grandfather's attic. Detective Sullivan had responded to Emma's call personally, initially skeptical about what might amount to nothing more than an elderly man's unusual hobby. Vintage toy collecting wasn't uncommon among Harold Brennan's generation, and Halloween memorabilia could be explained by his decades of handing out candy to neighborhood children. But when she had climbed the narrow attic stairs and seen the organization and scope of the collection, she had immediately understood that this was evidence of something far more sinister. The cardboard box containing Sarah's Halloween bag had been just the beginning. Deeper in the attic, behind a false wall that Emma had discovered only by accident, when she knocked over a heavy mirror, investigators found a space that had been converted into what could only be described as a shrine. Dozens of Halloween bags lined wooden shelves, each one labeled with a date spanning nearly 30 years. Children's toys were arranged with museum-like precision, and hundreds of photographs were sorted into carefully maintained albums. The methodical nature of the collection suggested that Harold Brennan had been documenting his crimes with the precision of someone who believed he would never be caught. Each Halloween bag corresponded to a specific date, and forensics teams were working to match the dates with missing children reports from the past 3 decades. The photographs were being compared to images of missing children from across the sea region, though many were too degraded or unclear to make definitive identifications. Margaret's first instinct had been to demand immediate access to the house, to see with her own eyes the place where her daughter's final moments might have been spent. Detective Sullivan had gently but firmly explained that the scene was still being processed, that disturbing evidence could compromise the investigation that might finally provide the answers Margaret had been seeking for 18 years. The waiting felt impossible after so many years of wondering, but Margaret forced herself to trust the process that had finally brought her closer to the truth. The 3 days between the discovery and Detective Sullivan's follow-up call were the longest of Margaret's life. She found herself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything except the phone call that might bring news of what had happened in Harold Brennan's house. She had created dozens of theories over the years about Sarah's disappearance, ranging from stranger abduction to scenarios she knew were impossible for a 12-year-old girl. But she had never imagined that the answer might have been living just 8 blocks away, volunteering at the same hospital where Sarah had been born. When Detective Sullivan finally called with an update, her voice carried a heaviness that prepared Margaret for devastating news. The forensics team had found evidence that multiple children had been in Harold Brennan's house over the years, though the physical evidence was too degraded to determine exactly what had happened to them. What they could confirm was that Sarah had been there on Halloween night in 1998, and that she had never left alive. The photographs found in the attic told a story that made Margaret physically ill. Harold Brennan had been documenting his crimes with the methodical precision of someone who believed he would never be caught. Pictures showed children in costumes, looking confused and frightened, taken in what appeared to be the basement of the house. Sarah's photograph was there, still wearing her princess costume, her tiara slightly askew, her dark eyes wide with an expression Margaret had never seen before, fear and confusion replacing the excitement that had sparkled there just hours earlier. Looking at that photograph, Margaret finally understood the moment when her daughter's Halloween adventure had turned into something unimaginably terrible. Sarah's face showed the exact instant when she realized that the kind grandfather who had offered to help her was not the safe harbor he had appeared to be. The princess costume that had made her feel magical and powerful had become the outfit she would forever be remembered wearing in her final hours. Margaret insisted on visiting the house, despite Detective Sullivan's warnings about what she might encounter there. She needed to see the place where her daughter had spent her final hours, needed to understand the environment that had stolen Sarah's future and destroyed her family's happiness. The basement had been converted into a play area that might have seemed innocent to a casual observer, but Margaret could see the sinister purpose behind the carefully arranged toys and games. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest 2-story, colonial that blended seamlessly into the suburban neighborhood where Harold Brennan had lived undetected for more than 4 decades. The front yard was well maintained, the driveway was neatly paved, and the exterior showed no signs of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. Margaret found herself studying the windows, wondering if Sarah had looked out through any of them, hoping for rescue that would never come. Inside, the house felt simultaneously ordinary and menacing. The living room contained furniture that could have belonged to any elderly man, photographs of Harold Brennan with his family at various celebrations and milestones, evidence of a life that had appeared completely normal to everyone who knew him. But knowing what she now knew about his true nature, Margaret could see the careful facade he had constructed, the deliberate presentation of himself as a harmless community member. The basement revealed the full scope of Harold Brennan's deception. What appeared to be a rec room for entertaining grandchildren was actually a carefully designed trap, equipped with soundproofing materials disguised as decorative panels and locks that could only be opened from the outside. The toys and games were arranged to appeal to children of different ages, suggesting that Brennan had been prepared to adapt his approach based on the specific child he managed to lure into his home. Margaret spent hours in that basement, trying to imagine Sarah's experience there, attempting to understand her daughter's final moments through the physical evidence that remained. Detective Sullivan stayed with her throughout the visit, answering questions when possible and providing quiet support when the emotional weight became too overwhelming. The hardest part was leaving, walking away from the place where Sarah's story had ended, while knowing that her daughter would never leave that house alive. The investigation revealed that Harold Brennan had been responsible for at least 12 disappearances over 3 decades, always targeting children between the ages of 8 and 13 who were trick-or-treating alone or in small groups. He had perfected a technique of offering to help children who appeared lost or confused, leading them to his house under the pretense of calling their parents or providing directions home. His volunteer work at the Children's Hospital had provided him with the perfect cover story for his interest in young people, and his reputation as a kind, elderly gentleman had insulated him from suspicion. Margaret learned that Sarah had been approached outside the community center where the Halloween party had been canceled at the last minute due to a power outage. Confused and disappointed, Sarah had been walking home alone when Harold Brennan had offered to drive her, claiming he had just spoken to Margaret and been asked to pick her up. The 12-year-old girl, raised to trust adults and follow instructions, had climbed into his car without resistance. The detail that haunted Margaret most was how easily Sarah had been deceived. Her daughter had been taught about stranger danger, had practiced scenarios about what to do if approached by someone she didn't know, had been given all the tools that parents believe will keep their children safe. But Harold Brennan had understood that children were programmed to trust authority figures, especially those who claimed to be acting on behalf of their parents. The confrontation Margaret had been both dreading and craving would never happen. Harold Brennan had taken his secrets to the grave, dying peacefully in his sleep, while Margaret spent another sleepless night wondering what had happened to her daughter, the justice she had imagined, the moment of reckoning where she could look. Her daughter's killer in the eyes and demand answers would forever remain a fantasy. But something unexpected began to happen as the investigation continued and more details emerged about Harold Brennan's crimes. Margaret found herself connecting with other families who had lost children to the same predator, parents who had spent years trapped in the same cycle of hope and despair that had defined her existence since 1998. Together, they began to find a different kind of closure than the confrontational justice she had always imagined. The first meeting was arranged by Detective Sullivan, who had identified 4 other families whose children appeared to have been victims of Harold Brennan's crimes. Margaret had been nervous about facing other parents who had experienced the same devastating loss, worried that their shared tragedy would intensify rather than diminish the pain they all carried. Instead, she found herself in the presence of people who understood her grief in ways that even the most well-meaning friends and family members never could. The families formed a support group that met monthly, sharing memories of their children, and working together to ensure that Harold Brennan's victims were properly memorialized. They lobbied for changes in how missing children cases were investigated, pushing for better coordination between jurisdictions and more thorough background checks for volunteers who worked with young people. Their advocacy work gave meaning to their loss, transforming their grief into action that might prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating tragedy. Margaret discovered that healing didn't require the dramatic confrontation she had always envisioned. Instead, it came through the slow, careful work of rebuilding her life around the memory of her daughter, rather than the mystery of her disappearance. She began volunteering with organizations that supported other families of missing children, using her experience to help parents navigate the impossible landscape of unresolved grief. The work was difficult, often triggering her own memories and reopening wounds she thought had scarred over. But it also provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since Sarah's disappearance. Every family she helped, every parent she guided through the early stages of their own nightmare became a way of honoring her daughter's memory and ensuring that Sarah's story contributed to something positive in the world. On Halloween night 2017, nearly 19 years after Sarah's disappearance, Margaret did something she hadn't done since 1998. She handed out candy to trick-or-treaters, smiling at their costumes and complimenting their creativity. Each child who came to her door received a full-size candy bar and a gentle reminder to stay with their groups and check in with their parents. The decision to participate in Halloween again had been gradual, evolving through months of therapy and countless conversations with the other families in her support group. Margaret had realized that avoiding the holiday forever meant allowing Harold Brennan to steal not just her daughter's life, but her own ability to find joy in the traditions that Sarah had loved. Opening her door to costumed children felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from her, honoring Sarah's memory by celebrating the magic of childhood rather than hiding from reminders of what had been lost. As the evening wound down, and the last of the costumed children headed home, Margaret sat on her front porch holding a framed photograph of Sarah in her princess costume. The picture had been taken just hours before her daughter left for what should have been a magical night of fun and friendship. Sarah's gap-toothed grin seemed to shine through the glass, her dark eyes sparkling with excitement about the adventures that lay ahead. Margaret finally understood that her daughter's story didn't end in Harold Brennan's basement. Sarah's legacy lived on in the safety measures implemented because of her case, in the families who found comfort through the support group, in the volunteers who were now more carefully screened before working with children. The 12-year-old girl who had skipped down the sidewalk that Halloween night in 1998 had become a catalyst for changes that might prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating loss. The orange Halloween bag that had sat in Harold Brennan's attic for 18 years was eventually returned to Margaret, along with Sarah's other belongings that had been recovered from the house. She chose to bury the bag with Sarah's remains, which had finally been located and identified through advances in forensic technology that hadn't existed in 1998. The funeral that should have happened nearly 2 decades earlier finally took place in 2017, providing the closure that had seemed impossible for so many years. The service was attended by hundreds of people, from childhood friends of Sarah's, who were now adults with children of their own, to members of the law enforcement community, who had never forgotten the little girl in the princess costume. Detective Rodriguez, now in his 70s, served as one of the pallbearers, his weathered face reflecting the weight of all the cases that had stayed with him long after retirement. Margaret planted a garden in Sarah's memory, choosing flowers that bloomed in October so that every Halloween would bring beauty instead of only sorrow. She continued her advocacy work, speaking at conferences about child safety and supporting legislation designed to protect vulnerable young people from predators who hide behind masks of respectability. Her testimony before state legislative committees was powerful, not because of its drama, but because of its quiet determination to ensure that Sarah's death contributed to preventing others. The healing Margaret found wasn't the dramatic, cathartic moment she had once imagined. Instead, it was a gradual process of learning to carry her grief differently, transforming her pain into purpose and her daughter's memory into a force for positive change. Sarah Chen would remain forever 12 years old, forever dressed as a princess, forever skipping toward an adventure that was cut tragically short. But her mother had finally found a way to honor that memory without being destroyed by the mystery that had surrounded it for so long.